They said it was a nuisance. They claimed it violated some petty, forgotten rule about natural aesthetics and drainage control. The HOA, drunk on its own small power, sent its final notice. Take down the dam or face fines so crippling they'd lose the house. But what they failed to grasp was that this small, homemade structure wasn't a defiance of their rules. It was the only thing standing between their perfectly manicured, upscale neighborhood and an unimaginable disaster. They forced me to rip out the foundation. They celebrated their victory. What they didn't know was that in tearing down my structure, they had signed the death warrant for their own little paradise. What happens when the petty tyranny of an HOA meets the unstoppable force of gravity? You're about to find out. The property felt less like a house and more like an achievement. It was perched at the very edge of Maple Creek Estates, a community of winding, perfectly paved roads where every lawn was uniformly emerald and every mailbox stood at a military-precise angle. Our main character, Alex, had sunk everything into this place. He wasn't one of the old money types that populated the center of the estates. He was a contractor, a hands-on guy who saw the property not as a trophy but as a project, a place he could truly shape and protect. Alex's parcel was unique. It bordered the community's western boundary, where the manicured lawns dissolved into natural terrain. This boundary wasn't just a fence line. It was a subtle, sloping valley that led down to the creek. This little waterway was technically part of the HOA's common property, but since it abutted the woods and only seemed to collect rainwater, the HOA had long treated it as irrelevant. To Alex, however, the creek was the reason for his home's particular charm and its unique problem. During the heavy spring rains, the creek wasn't a charming trickle. It was a swelling, muddy current that threatened to undermine the very foundation of his lower yard and, worse, drag debris directly into the estate's shared drainage system. The solution he devised was simple, elegant, and born of pure necessity: a low-profile, carefully engineered earthen dam. It was just a few feet high, built with local stone and packed earth, designed to slow the runoff and redirect the water naturally. It wasn't visible from the main street. It was a silent, hard-working guardian for his property. For 5 peaceful years, the dam did its job perfectly. The water flowed, the ground stayed firm, and the HOA's neatly arranged world remained dry. Alex lived his life, oblivious to the fact that his necessary little defense had become an unwitting piece of unauthorized architecture. The quiet was shattered not by a flood, but by an envelope marked with the familiar, imperious seal of the Maple Creek Estates Board. It wasn't about the dam at first. The letter stated, in chillingly bureaucratic language, that Alex was delinquent on a new special assessment fee, a measly few $100s intended to plant new, identical shrubs at the neighborhood entrance, a fee he had genuinely overlooked. It was a minor clerical error, but for the HOA, it was the opening shot. The first communication was a warning. The second was a threat, and the third introduced the true antagonist, Mrs. Albright, the self-appointed guardian of all things proper in Maple Creek, who had now, finally, noticed the earth and stone anomaly bordering the woods. The stage was set, not for a financial dispute, but for a war over authority and survival. The pettiness of an unpaid fee was about to ignite a cataclysm over a dam built to save them all. The initial letter, the one about the overdue $200 assessment fee, was merely the bureaucratic pretext. The true motive, the insidious target, was the dam. It started with a notice of violation, a thick, official document accusing Alex of constructing an unapproved, non-conforming permanent structural modification on property adjacent to HOA common land. The language was sterile, but the intent was sharp. Take it down. Alex, the contractor who built things to last, read the order and felt a cold stab of disbelief. This wasn't some flimsy shed. This was a crucial piece of drainage infrastructure. He tried to reason with them. He gathered his engineering diagrams, his topographical maps, and a 5-year history of the creek's stable banks, all of which proved that his dam was not a modification for fun, but a safeguard against failure. He went to the monthly board meeting, ready to present his defense. That's where he met Mrs. Albright in the flesh. She sat at the head of the table, a perfectly coiffed, iron-willed woman whose entire existence seemed dedicated to enforcing the petty rituals of Maple Creek. She didn't look at Alex's diagrams. She looked at his hands, judging the man who worked for a living. "Mr. Benson," she stated, her voice tight and dismissive, "the documents you've brought concern water flow. This board concerns aesthetics and rules. We have an ordinance against structures that impede the natural appearance of the common grounds. Your dam is rustic where Maple Creek is refined. The fact you are delinquent on your special assessment shows a pattern of disregard for the community. We don't need your structure. We need your compliance." The arrogance was staggering. They saw his labor, his protection, as a mark of class difference, a blight on their refined tableau. Alex tried to pivot back to the facts. "Mrs. Albright, the dam is preventing erosion that will eventually affect the entire lower tier of the community. It's a fail-safe if you remove it. When the next big rain comes," she cut him off with a crisp slam of the gavel. "The issue is the dam. The matter is settled. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in a 100 per day fine, retroactive to the date of the initial violation." The battle lines were drawn, not over water, but over power. The next stage was not just about the dam. It was about making Alex miserable. The fines started accruing instantly, not just the $100 per day for the dam, but now suddenly they remembered the small, outstanding $200 fee, which they doubled, then tripled with late charges. Alex, driven by a fury that overcame his sense of caution, dug in. He would fight them in small claims court, but the HOA had resources, and more importantly, they had time. The violation notices escalated into absurd harassment. He received a fine for his lawn being 1 inch too high. A week later, another for having a single unapproved species of flower in his garden bed. Then came the ultimate absurdity, a fine for the color of the gravel on his driveway. Apparently, it did not match the community standard, a standard that had never been clearly documented. The cumulative effect was designed to be crushing. The total fines began to climb past $5,000, then $8,000. The stress was constant. Every time he opened his mailbox, his stomach twisted, knowing another violation awaited him. He was becoming an outsider in his own home, hunted by the very people who were supposed to represent him. The rest of the neighbors, paralyzed by fear of Mrs. Albright's punitive regime, said nothing. They averted their eyes, whispering condolences that faded the moment they stepped back inside their conforming houses. The turning point came when the HOA used the leverage of the mounting debt. They sent a chilling letter from their attorney. Due to the excessive continuing violations and the accruing fines, the board had placed a lien on his property. They were no longer just fighting for a dam. They were fighting for the very right to his home. This move was the emotional break. Alex was cornered, exhausted by the relentless pettiness and the sheer cost of fighting the legal battle. He saw the cold logic of their strategy. They were trying to bleed him dry until the financial weight of the fines exceeded the value of fighting the lien. He called his own attorney, a man specialized in property law, and laid out the situation. The lawyer's advice was grim. The HOA had followed the technical procedure, no matter how ridiculous the cause. The only guaranteed way to stop the bleed and prevent foreclosure proceedings from commencing was to remove the violation. "But if I remove the dam, my property will flood," Alex pleaded. "Legally, Alex, that is not the HOA's problem. Their only legal mandate is to enforce the covenants. You have to remove the physical structure. Then you sue them for damages when the flooding happens. But first you have to save your house." It was a bitter, impossible choice. Give the HOA the victory or lose everything. Alex realized the true scale of their pettiness. They would rather risk a long-term geological instability than admit they were wrong about a $200 fee and a handful of dirt and stone. He drove his small excavator down to the creek, the machine feeling heavier than usual. He was dismantling his own defense, his own hard work. An act of self-sabotage forced by a group of people who valued lawn color over land stability. Mrs. Albright actually drove by, slowing her SUV just enough to watch him work, a small triumphant smile playing on her lips. She thought she had won. As the last heavy stones were pulled from the bed and the meticulously packed earth was scattered, the creek looked different. It looked raw, exposed. Alex knew that the next serious rain wouldn't be slowed. It would be funneled. The immediate danger was gone. The fines stopped accruing, and the lien process paused. But the psychological damage was done. Alex was empty, feeling the weight of the injustice. He stared at the newly exposed bank, a feeling of cold dread replacing the anger. The HOA had forced him to give them what they wanted. What they didn't realize was that they hadn't just removed a dam. They had removed the only barrier between their beautiful, fragile community and the vast, unforgiving power of nature. They had demanded compliance. Now, nature was about to demand a price. The destruction of the dam was supposed to be the end of it. It was the HOA's victory, a final declaration that their rules mattered more than reality. Alex had complied, the fines were paused, and Mrs. Albright believed the problem, both the structural one and the dissenting homeowner, had been neutralized. She couldn't have been more wrong. The problem wasn't neutralized. It was simply transferred from Alex's yard to the entire community. For 2 weeks, the weather was deceptively calm. Alex was numb, going through the motions, staring out at the exposed, vulnerable creek bed every evening. He felt the tension building not in the air, but in the ground itself. He checked the long-range forecast constantly, looking for the inevitable, for the moment his warnings would become a devastating prophecy. Then, the sky turned that unsettling, bruised purple. The storm arrived not as a gradual rain, but as a sudden torrential downpour, the kind that breaks records and tests every piece of infrastructure. The rain gauge quickly jumped, and the little trickle that was the creek swelled into a churning, muddy torrent within minutes. Alex stood by his window, a grim, sick knot tightening in his stomach. He wasn't watching for damage to his house. He was watching for the disaster he had tried so desperately to prevent. Without the earthen dam to slow its momentum and spread the flow, the water had only one path, straight down the newly exposed channel. The velocity was terrifying. It ripped at the banks, tearing away at the carefully manicured ground that bordered the HOA common property. Within the first hour, the water had carved a deep, jagged gash, a canyon of mud and debris, right where Alex's property met the estate's golf course and the backyards of the most influential board members. This wasn't just erosion. This was geological revenge. The water, carrying large stones and tree limbs, slammed into the estate's main drainage system, a series of small, aesthetic culverts that the HOA proudly considered state-of-the-art. These culverts were engineered for the expected runoff, not for the unchecked fury of a damless torrent. The culverts choked instantly, backing up the surging water. The backup had nowhere to go but up and sideways, directly into the low-lying sections of Maple Creek Estates. The first place it found purchase was the beautifully maintained yard of Mr. Peterson, the HOA treasurer, whose home was situated right at the bottom of the slope. Alex grabbed his phone and started recording. He felt no triumph, only a detached, horrible vindication. The scene he captured was pure, horrifying chaos. The water breached the low retaining wall of Peterson's yard, transforming his meticulously fertilized lawn into a muddy lake in under 15 minutes. Then the real terror began. The water began to flow down the main street, turning the perfect pavement into a dangerous, fast-moving river. Mrs. Albright's house was further up the hill, but her perfect, custom-poured circular driveway suddenly became the terminus for a cascade of runoff. The force of the diverted water, unable to follow its normal dammed path, slammed into her front landscaping. She emerged from her front door in a panic, dressed in an immaculate raincoat, holding a designer umbrella that was utterly useless against the storm. She saw the mud, the debris, and the rising angry waterline creeping toward her own expensive property. But what truly broke her composure was seeing Alex. He was standing on the highest, safest point of his property, phone in hand, watching the destruction unfold with a stone-cold, awful stillness. She ran toward the boundary line, her pristine white rain boots sinking into the now saturated lawn, screaming over the sound of the rain and the rushing water. "Alex, what is this? You have to stop this! Get a sandbag! Divert it!" Her voice was frantic, the iron will finally dissolving into pure, desperate fear. Alex lowered his phone, the image of her desperation perfectly captured. He didn't move an inch. He didn't shout. He spoke clearly, deliberately, the cold, emotionless tone far more powerful than any scream. "Stop it. I built the thing that was stopping it. You forced me to take it down, Mrs. Albright. You told me it violated aesthetic rules. You fined me thousands of dollars and put a lien on my home because of a $200 oversight and a structure you didn't like. The rain was relentless, washing the makeup from her face. This is your community, Mrs. Albright. You wanted compliance. This is the natural flow of water, exactly as you demanded. This is the consequence of your rules being more important than physics. This is what you bought with your arrogance. The climax reached its peak when the sound of the rush was joined by the sickening crunch of collapsing earth. A section of the main HOA road, undermined by the now uncontrolled erosion along the creek bed, suddenly slumped inward. It wasn't a sinkhole, but a massive structural failure, a huge, impassable fissure right at the entrance to the lower tier of the estates, cutting off access for nearly a dozen homes. The financial, aesthetic, and structural consequences had just become brutally, terrifyingly real. Mrs. Albright stood there, staring at the destruction that had literally cracked her perfect community. The police were arriving, sirens wailing uselessly through the torrent. The fire department was trying to set up barricades, but the water was too fast. Alex didn't need to say another word. The scene screamed the truth. He was right. They were wrong, and their petty victory had just cost them everything. He turned off the camera, the memory card holding the indelible proof of their demise. He looked down at the mud that was now creeping, toward the bottom of his own retaining wall, a wall he had meticulously protected with his dam, and felt a chilling sense of finality. The HOA had forced him to take away their shield. Now the storm was taking their community. The confrontation was over. The physical damage was done. All that remained now was the reckoning. The sirens faded, replaced by the relentless drumming of residual rain and the sickening sloshing sounds of floodwaters receding from ruined carpet and saturated drywall. The structural failure of the main road, the gaping maw where the pavement had once been, was the physical manifestation of the HOA's arrogance. The climax had delivered the disaster, and now began the slow, agonizing process of the reckoning. In the immediate days that followed, the atmosphere in Maple Creek Estates shifted from upscale complacency to outright panic. The financial cost of the disaster was astronomical. Insurance adjusters swarmed the neighborhood, but their reports quickly pointed to the same undeniable truth. The cause of the catastrophic erosion and subsequent structural damage was the deliberate, forced removal of an established flow control structure. They weren't dealing with a natural disaster. They were dealing with man-made negligence. The spotlight of blame, intense and unforgiving, fell squarely on the HOA board and specifically on Mrs. Albright. Alex did not have to file his lawsuit in isolation. The dozens of families on the lower tier of the estates whose homes had sustained thousands in water damage and whose property values had plummeted overnight moved first. They mounted a furious collective recall effort. The whispers that had once been hushed now turned into loud, angry demands for accountability. Mrs. Albright, facing not just a legal challenge but the absolute collapse of her social standing, resigned in disgrace within 48 hours, refusing to even address the emergency community meeting. The entire old board, the ones who had signed off on the dam's demolition to enforce a petty rule about aesthetics, followed her out the door. The new humbled board, operating under the scrutiny of multiple insurance companies and a looming class action threat, had no choice but to confront the truth. They needed to know exactly why the structure was removed. Alex provided the answer. He presented the new board with his original engineering analysis, the same documents Mrs. Albright had casually dismissed as irrelevant water flow data. Alongside this, he presented the stack of absurd violation notices, the 100-per-day dam fine, the unapproved flower fine, the wrong color gravel fine, all tied together by the ultimate threat, the property lien. His attorney summarized the situation in stark, undeniable terms. The dam was removed under duress, not because it was structurally unsound, but because the HOA used extortionary legal pressure over a minimal, unrelated financial dispute. Alex didn't want revenge. He wanted vindication. But what he received was far more satisfying. The new board and the insurance consortium immediately conceded. The legal battle evaporated. Every fine Alex had ever been issued, stretching back years, was instantly nullified and erased. The lien placed on his home, the very weapon they had used to force his compliance, was ceremoniously lifted and publicly apologized for. Furthermore, in a final act of financial justice, Alex received a substantial settlement that covered his legal fees, compensated him for the 2 agonizing weeks of stress and harassment, and recognized the inherent value of the protective structure he had built. But the true victory was not financial. It was the public and permanent admission of their systemic failure. The long-term consequences for Maple Creek Estates were permanent and profound. The settlement Alex received was merely a drop in the bucket compared to the total cost. Since the damage was deemed the result of HOA action, not a natural act, the community itself, the remaining homeowners, were now on the hook for the massive cleanup and reconstruction effort. Within months, the new board levied the largest special assessment in the estate's history. It wasn't $200 for new shrubs. It was $45,000 per household to stabilize the soil, repair the collapsed road section, and, most ironically, to build an official, HOA-approved, multi-million-dollar flood control system exactly where Alex's simple, elegant dam had once stood. The community was permanently divided into those who could absorb the massive debt and those who were forced to sell their now devalued, flood-prone homes. Mrs. Albright and her old guard watched from the sidelines as the perfect world they policed so rigidly dissolved into a financial and structural nightmare. Their petty focus on aesthetics had cost them their entire community. As for Alex, he stayed. His home was now safe, his reputation restored, and his small dam now stood, figuratively, as a symbol of defiance. In a final, delicious twist of irony, the new HOA board, stripped of their power and desperate for competence, contracted Alex and his company to oversee and construct the new massive water retention structure. He was paid handsomely to rebuild the very thing they had forced him to tear down. He stood on the edge of the creek watching his team work, the new structure a monument not to his victory but to their disastrous folly. He had tried to warn them. He had pleaded with them to prioritize safety over snobbery, substance over appearance. They chose to exercise their petty authority over a fine, and in doing so, they opened the floodgates of their own destruction. It wasn't revenge. It was the inevitable, brutal consequence of small minds wielding great power. The story of the dam is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things are not the storms outside, but the rigid, unbending rules within. It proves that when the structure of governance values arrogance and compliance above common sense and human decency, the resulting breakdown is not just inevitable, but spectacular. You might think your HOA rules are just small, annoying details. But I promise you, there's a Mrs. Albright in every community, and all it takes is one power trip to unleash a flood you can't stop. How high do the fines have to stack before the flood waters rise in your own neighborhood?